Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here in St. Louis. I've not been able to be at as many conferences as John, but a few of them, both the big week one and several of these regional conferences, and they really are a great opportunity. To save them, and this Our Lady is speaking after she's shown the vision of souls falling into hell. To save them, God wishes to establish in the world devotion to my Immaculate Heart. If what I say to you is done, many souls will be saved, and there will be peace. The war is going to end, but if people do not cease offending God, a worse war will break out during the reign of Pius XI. When you see the night of the sky illuminated by an unknown light, know that this is the great sign given you by God, that he is about to punish the world for the crimes by means of war, famine, and persecutions against the Church and against the Holy Father. To prevent this, I shall come to ask for the consecration of Russia to my Immaculate Heart and the communion of reparation on the first Saturdays. If my requests are heeded, Russia will be converted and there will be peace. If not, she will spread her errors throughout the world, causing wars and persecution against the Church. The good will be martyred, the Holy Father will have much to suffer, various nations will be annihilated. The Mother of God. Now, in my experience with the message of Fatima, there are unfortunately two extremes that I often observe in reading and understanding the message. One extreme is represented by the Vatican cover-up, for lack of a better word, of 2000. The message of Fatima is over, it already happened, it's in the past. Right? The other extreme is to put the message of Fatima solely in the future. To say, it's something's going to happen, there's going to be this chastisement in the future, let's speculate and talk about all the things that will happen in the future. And really, as in all things Catholic, the right interpretation is neither of those. So the message of Fatima has spoken about things that have occurred in the past, the Second World War being the obvious example from this passage. There are obviously things still, notwithstanding what Cardinal Sodano and crew tried to say in 2000, to unfold in the future. But yet there are still unfolding presently, that these words that Our Lady has given us are happening. And we're going to focus in on really two aspects of this element of the secret that I just read to you: Russia spreading her errors and various nations being annihilated. So first, a few statistics, put that in context. The population of the United States is estimated at 323,995,000. Population of Portugal's 10,617,000. Brazil, 205,823,000. France, a little over 63,000. Italy, over 59,000. China, the most populous nation, 1.39 billion. In the United States, since 1973, it is estimated there have been over 59 million abortions. So equal to the population of Italy, roughly close to the population of France, greatly in excess of the population of Portugal, have suffered abortion. Worldwide abortions, since only 1980, that's as far back as I could get reliable statistics. That doesn't even include prior to 1980. Worldwide, as of this past June, 1,417,000,000. Larger than the most populous nation on earth. So clearly, there may be more nations to be annihilated in the future, but we are witnessing for the past decades the continual annihilation of nations, just in terms of these numbers. Why is this happening? Why is this getting worse? And we think about it, for decades in this country, very well-meaning people have fought very hard against abortion in this country, and basically very little has changed. Whoever gets elected, whatever promises this particular candidate that everyone runs behind, oh, he's pro-life, basically nothing has changed. Why is it? Essentially, it's in the secret, the answer: Russia has spread her errors. In some prior conferences here and at Catholic Family News as well, I've spoken about how we often are fighting the battle but losing the war, because although we're fighting for good causes, we're actually conceding the principles underlying our fight by using the ideas and the understanding and even the vocabulary of our enemies. So we're opposed to abortion, but the way we talk about it and explain it, we're actually conceding the very principles that led to abortion in the first place. And I talked about that at a more theoretical level before. So really today, what I want to do is use this topic of abortion to illustrate that more particularly by looking at this issue. So we're going to look at the principles on why abortion is wrong, and then we're going to look at some history to see how some specific historical examples have played out and how we got to this position where we're letting nations, and I'm going to focus on that word nations. It doesn't just say lots of people. There's a very difference between a billion people and a nation, and we'll focus on that a little bit towards the end. And even just before we get started, as a side note, I'd just like to point out, if you ever thought about it, even the very vocabulary of the organized movement against abortion, how is it described? The pro-life movement. Right? We just say that so often, we're used to it, but stop and think about it. It's already conceding some ground because it's ambiguous, right? It's I'm pro-life. Well, as you know, a lot of these politicians, they can mean a lot of different things by that. I'm personally pro-life, I'm in favor of life, but I'm opposed to the government regulating abortion, right? It's ambiguous. It doesn't actually say what we really should be saying, which is we are against abortion. And I've seen a lot of pro-life people and say, you're anti-abortionist. No, we're pro-life. Well, what's the matter with you? This is 1.4 billion people are being killed, and you're not willing to say, I'm against this? I'm anti-abortion? Our ancestors who fought against the injustice of slavery had enough understanding to say what they were. They called themselves the anti-slavery movement, the abolitionist movement. So even in that little detail, notice we want to appear, acceptable and well, we're pro-life. No, we're against something. We are in favor of something as well. That's true. We're in favor of Our Lady, of the social reign of Christ the King. But being in favor of something also means you take a stand against something. So even just thinking that small detail, how we've sort of absorbed a bit of the culture. Well, there was a particular incident that actually led me to think about this talk. Presidential contender Donald Trump set off one of his sort of media storms when he made some comments about abortion several months ago. Now, obviously, Trump, it's really hard to know what the person thinks because he says one thing one day, he says another thing the next day, he says something 2 years ago, so I'm not really sure what he really thinks. But on this occasion, what he said was really kind of interesting, even if you didn't appreciate perhaps how interesting it is. A reporter asked him if he supported the criminalization of abortion if Roe v. Wade were overturned, and if so, would women who procure abortions receive some sort of punishment? In which case, Trump said, well, yes. I don't know what they'd be, but there should be some punishment if they've done this. This set off this firestorm. A few hours later, he reversed his position, not a surprise. But in that moment, it was really fascinating because he's talking to this Catholic reporter. And Trump, this non-Catholic, points out the hypocrisy of this reporter. And he says, well, aren't you Catholic? He says, well, that's not important. He says, but if you're Catholic, your church says people should be punished who have abortions. That's their position. Well, but that's what the church thinks, and the church really can't have anything to say about this, and this is law, and that's the church. And Trump is just like, you don't make any sense. Now, this guy who often doesn't make sense can see how nonsensical this Catholic is. We're in a pretty bad state, right? But it's true. I mean, again, whether he knew it or not, he's absolutely right. We'll get to the details in a minute, but the church imposes her most severe penalty on a person who procures an abortion. And again, this Catholic reporter doesn't even seem to understand why that is. So let's go through, first of all, and look at the history of the church's teaching on abortion. And first, want to dispel one of the rumors that enemies of this cause use all the time. Oh, the church just made up this doctrine. I mean, sadly, this is encouraged by the hierarchy at the highest levels today. Oh, we just sort of talk too much about these days. Well, that's not true. It's not a these days issue. There's a certain need to talk about it more because the problem's bigger, right? If very few people are having abortions, you don't need that. The urgency is not as there. But still, the church has talked consistently and taught consistently about abortion from the very beginning. And I'll just give you a few examples, which are good examples to have when you're arguing with someone, because they'll do this a lot. Oh, well, the church used to not really care about abortion or said it was okay and changed in 1960 or something like that. False. So in the Didache, which is the doctrine on the teaching of the apostles, we have texts, copies of it which date from the 1st century. Abortion is specifically condemned, so this is in the apostolic times, along with infanticide, the killing of a baby after birth, are considered together. Early Christians in pagan times were very well known for the fact that they were opposed to abortion. So the church, one of the characteristics by which people knew, oh, you're not pagan, you're Catholic, you're Christian, is because you are opposed to abortion as well as the Roman practice of exposing newborn babies to die. Clement of Alexandria, AD 150 to 180, said, "Our whole life can go on in observation of the laws of nature. If we gain dominion over our desires from the beginning, and if we do not kill by various means of a perverse art the human offspring, born according to the designs of divine providence, for these women who, in order to hide their immorality, use abortive drugs, which expel the child completely dead, abort at the same time their own human feelings." Again, early 2nd century. Saint Athenagoras, AD 165. "We say that women who induce abortions are murderers and will have to give account of it to God. For the same person would not regard the child in the womb as a living being and therefore an object of God's care and then kill it. But we are altogether consistent in our conduct. We obey reason and do not override it." As far back as the patristic era, not only did Catholics hold abortion to be wrong, but they held that anyone who perpetrated the act, anyone involved, an accessory to it, was objectively, and here we speak objectively of the act, guilty of the act. Although St. Thomas Aquinas, who was following the scientific knowledge of Aristotle, misunderstood the actual time at which a human life came into existence, he taught that the killing of an animated fetus, a human body infused with a soul, was a homicide in all cases. He taught that any act which prevented or stopped the natural process leading to the ensoulment of a new human being to be a closely related, same category of grave sin. Aquinas, like most people prior to the invention of medical knowledge, that does now allows us to look within inside the body and see what is happening prior to the time when we can otherwise perceive what's occurring inside, thought that conception, defined as the soul, the human soul entering the body, happened when the woman could first feel the presence of a moving animate body. So again, a lot of people misuse Aquinas and say, oh, he was allowing abortion up until the 20th week or some nonsense like that. Not at all. He was saying the moment the soul enters the body, that's an abortion if you kill it. But what's important is, okay, he misunderstood the science. He thought, he didn't know because it's so small, we couldn't perceive it, that prior to that time of movement, there was an ensouled body. For him, it really didn't matter that much because he said they're both gravely, seriously wrong. So if it's before the soul enters, you are preventing the ensoulment of the body after you are committing homicide. And he says they're just basically a hair's difference, very, very small difference between them. So again, it's very important. A lot of these people misuse what he says to say he permitted it. He didn't permit it. And if he certainly knew the science today, he would say, well, the line that I drew between preventing and homicide is further back. But he'd say, you're quibbling over something. They're both intrinsically evil and gravely wrong. It was merely just a matter of scientific knowledge. Notwithstanding this factual error in scientific knowledge, the principles taught by Aquinas and others are universally true. The intentional termination of life of an unborn child and the intentional obstruction of the ensoulment of new life following marital acts are gravely and intrinsically wrong, although to different degrees. Aquinas and others, due to this factual error, drew the line between these two wrong acts in an incorrect place. In 1869, the Church officially taught that what was thought about the time the soul entered the body was factually not correct as a matter of factual knowledge. Again, not correcting any principles. Principles were the same, but the factual knowledge to which the principles were applied, and said it was no longer possible to maintain that the soul entered the body at a later point in time. So abortion is intrinsically evil, but the pro-life movement tends to focus solely on the individual act of the homicide, right? And again, that's because we live in this liberal culture where there's only individuals in the state. There's only individuals who are floating around out there and super government. And so everything is directed against individuals. And they don't see why abortion is wrong in the larger context, why it is intrinsically wrong, and why it is effectively indistinguishable from contraception. Again, the other error of Russia that's led to abortion is most in the pro-life movement talk a lot about abortion. When it comes to contraception, well, let's just not mention that. Well, there's a lot of people who don't want to hear that. But essentially, if you admit contraception, you admit the principle of abortion. The Church, because of her philosophy, holds that what things are is a function of their end. A change in the definition of the end of something involves a change in the very definition of what it is. Here, the primary end of marriage, as the Church always and everywhere taught, was the procreation and rearing and education of children. By the end, we're saying the what for, the why. Why do we do something? Right? Aristotle had taught even before Christianity, every human that acts, everything that acts for an end. So if we engage in marriage, there's an end. And the Church said that end, that primary end, is the conception, the procreation of children, and then their education in a stable environment. Now, ends can also have subordinate or secondary ends. So there's a principal end that is the prime reason, but then collateral or secondary ends that also accompany it. So an example can help. The end of eating is to sustain life. So why do we eat? Fundamentally, the primary reason is to stay alive. But there are secondary ends to eating. If I come home, my wife wants to make a nice dinner. She makes it flavorful. She doesn't just sort of create a pot of nutrients, right? There's seasoning. And why? Because it gives some pleasure to us while we're eating to stay alive. We're also social creatures, so we eat together so we can talk, and you have the meal as an opportunity to engage in social activity. But these latter two are only secondary ends. So if we pursue them in and of themselves, we go into evil or vice. So the Romans, for example, who just wanted to enjoy and taste all the food, who would just eat it and, oh, this is wonderful, and then go vomit it up, were committing immoral acts because they disconnected the primary end. Again, nothing wrong with enjoying a good meal. But if you do it beyond what is ordered to the end of staying alive, you are committing a wrong because you inverted the order of the ends. You made the secondary end more important, or the primary purpose, as opposed to something that comes along with achieving the end. So along with marriage, having the procreation, rearing and education of children, there are a secondary and a tertiary end of marriage. The secondary end is the mutual help and comfort of the husband and wife. Right? So I can speak having 6 children, raising children. I don't even speak about the giving birth part. The raising part I can speak about with direct knowledge is hard. It's difficult. It's incredibly difficult to do on your own, which is why if God calls someone to do that by calling their husband or wife to their eternal reward early, he has to give special graces to that person. because raising a child on your own is not natural. It's much more difficult and requires greater assistance. And so to do that, the husband and wife, right, as we learn from divine revelation, right, Adam needs a helpmate, bone of his bone, flesh of his flesh, to make this work, to do this. And so that mutual support, that affection among the spouses is good because it's oriented to the primary end. So why do the husband and wife need intimacy and affection to support themselves? So that they're able to perform their primary end. And as Aquinas teaches, the third end is to avoid excesses of concupiscence. So these other ends are good, but they always have to be ordered to the primary end. So engaging in marital acts, say, well, I'm doing this so that I avoid even worse concupiscence, if it's not in the context of marriage, is totally upside down, right? You're committing a sin to say, I'll avoid other sins. No, right? The avoiding of concupiscence is the satisfaction through marriage to help keep faithful in the marriage. It's all got to be ordered to the primary end. And any act which goes against that primary end, which is incapable of furthering that primary end, is intrinsically wrong and can never be engaged in without exception, no exceptions. So this was the understanding of the church of why these acts were wrong, understanding the teaching on what marriage is and what its purpose is. That's why if you looked at just the few texts that we examined, they talk about the prevention of the conception of a child and the abortion in the same sentence, right? Because they're all, the actual object of them, that is their intrinsically evil nature, is perverting the end of marriage, engaging in marital acts and frustrating or terminating their natural end. That's what's wrong with them. Now, in the abortion case, there is also an injustice against the child that's conceived, but the primary focus of the church is actually that it's the attack against the end of marriage that is wrong, that is intrinsically wrong, of a greater degree. And again, we can see this, for example. If I actually say to you, killing another human being is not necessarily intrinsically evil, right? Murder is intrinsically evil, but not killing, because killing, it depends on the end, right? If I'm defending myself against an aggressor and I use proportionate force, I'm justified in that killing. I'm not committing a sin. Likewise, in a just war, killing is permitted. The execution by legitimate authorities of criminals in a state is not wrong. So killing another human being is not an act in and of itself that is incapable of being ordered to an end. It could be ordered to a good end, the preservation of society, for example. Contraception and abortion are completely opposed to the end, because there is no way to engage in them and further the end of marriage, because they always frustrate the end. And that's why, that's the primary reason why both contraception and abortion are wrong. Yes, abortion kills a baby, and that's bad, and that's wrong. But the primary focus that we've lost sight of through the errors of Russia, confusing our thinking, is that it is this great offense against marriage. And so no surprise, if you look at American jurisprudence, first contraception was legalized, 1950s, then abortion, then sodomy was decriminalized, and then we were forced to call black white and white black, and the states say that two people of the same gender engaging in simulations of marital acts are a marriage. They're all connected on a continuum, because all of those acts offend against the nature of marriage intrinsically. So when this in the legal realm, the secular legal realm, what was the turning point in these principles being abandoned? Well, it essentially came in the Second Vatican Council, in Gaudium et Spes, in a novelty which was introduced in the doctrine, in the document, and then would later be explained by novel philosophical thinkers afterwards. In the chapter of the dignity of matrimony and of the family, Robert de Mattei, historian, says, this document would incorporate the suggestion of the innovators rather than those of the defenders of traditional morality. What was their innovation? To topple the primary end of marriage. So the document just says there are ends of marriage, and it talks about all three. And it's ambiguous. It either saying they're all equal, or, in fact, the secondary end is more important than the primary. It's a little ambiguous, but it's either of those two. What is precluded is the clear teaching that the primary end is the procreation and rearing of children. Now, if they're all equal, it sort of means, well, if you're pursuing one of those ends, you're pursuing the end of marriage. As opposed to if you're not oriented to the primary end, it's intrinsically evil. And this is what the doctrine introduced, which has now filtered its way through the whole church, coming from this error. And in fact, as de Mattei points out in his historical work on the council, Cardinal Ruffini made a prophecy in the council hall when he spoke against this change in Gaudium et Spes. He criticized these innovators, and his prophecy has come to fulfillment in our day. He said, "It seems that the concept of matrimony, as we have understood it until now, dogmatically and morally has to change, at least in practice, by accepting this new definition. But, he says, is it possible that the church was mistaken until now, and that the adaptation to today's society forces us to declare that what was always held to be immoral is now in keeping with morality?" What he's saying is if you make this change and topple the primary purpose of marriage, everything that we said was wrong, eventually they're going to start saying is okay. And what just happened in the synod last year? Without going into detail, his prophecy has come to pass not only in the church, but in secular society, because of the undermining of these ordered ends of marriage. So I also said we go through, now that we see these principles, that the principal offense of abortion is an offense against marriage, against the end of marriage. And it is an attack on the family, not just an attack on the child. Granted it is, but it is an attack on the family fundamentally, because it is a civil war within the family and within society. Let's look at the history of how the laws against abortion have played out over history. Again, another reason for this is a lot of people will make false arguments, say, oh, well, abortion was legal. There was a right to abortion in the Middle Ages. And we'll see how they manipulate history to come up with this false claim. So as the patristic sources made clear, that if a woman did something to her own body to kill her child, it was a homicide, a grave act. Canon law, when it was codified in the Middle Ages, confirmed that anyone who did this or gave something to a woman to assist her in doing these acts was also guilty of the same crime. Gratian's first compilation of the canon law in his Decretum in Book 9, Chapter 5, in Book 5, Title 12, Chapter 5 states, "If anyone does something to a man or a woman," so clearly that's pre-abortion if it's a man, right? "To a man or a woman, or gives something to drink so that he cannot generate," again, that's pre-conception, "or she cannot conceive or offspring be born," that's abortion, "let him be held as a murderer." So notice the murderer is not only the one that commits abortion, the one who gives anything to prevent conception. Why? Because what are they murdering? They're murdering the family. Notwithstanding, again, the factual error in dating this moment of conception that we're so focused on in the modern world, the law, the canon law, applied equally to contraception so that he cannot generate or she cannot conceive as to abortion. It also applies to one not carrying the child, so the father, for a man, for example. It applies to someone who gives or does anything to assist in this process. In the beginning of the 13th century, Pope Innocent III declared, however, that different penalties should attach to what we would call contraception as opposed to abortion. Again, admitting that both offended against the same principle, but said a distinction of penalties should be applied. Although both were of the most grave and they were closely related sins. Automatic excommunication applied only to abortion. which occurred according, again, to the erroneous scientific knowledge of the time after the woman felt the child move. Different consequences applied to contraceptive acts, which could result in excommunication, but it would not be automatic, because there would have to be a hearing to actually delve into the details to see what was done. As I said, in 1869, Pius IX did away with this factual distinction and said at any moment after the marital act, when something is done, that should be treated as abortion. And continued and renewed the automatic excommunication for anyone who, following the marital act, engages in an act which prevents the birth of the child. This position was codified in the Pio Benedictine Code of 1917, which prescribed automatic excommunication for anyone procuring an abortion or providing it. The same provision was carried over to the 1983 Code in almost the same substance. Thus, it is clear under ecclesiastical law that anyone who intentionally causes the death of an unborn child is guilty of this grave offense and subject to penalty, and as I said in the beginning, the most severe penalty the church can enforce on earth: excommunication, severance from the body of Christ. Trump, incidentally or accidentally, in his exchange with Mr. Matthews, the reporter, draws our attention to this fact, that the church does impose, in fact, a punishment, in fact, its most severe punishment, on the person procuring the abortion. Thus far, we've been looking merely at the objective state, however, of the act. We've only not talking about people who perform it, just the act itself as meriting this punishment. Such an action is always intrinsically evil and can never be excused or say it's okay in this case. Yet, as with all human actions, the extent of a person's personal culpability can be over a range of actions, depending upon their knowledge and the freedom of their will. That's why canon law prescribes that in different circumstances, the same intrinsically moral act could have mitigated or lower consequences or punishments that reflect the culpability of the particular actor. So even though there may be an automatic excommunication, in certain cases that penalty may be lessened. The act itself is still wrong, but the penalty may be lessened in understanding that the punishment must fit the crime of the particular person. So canon law, for example, lists several of these circumstances. For example, by one who lacked the use of reason, one who had performed an act against their will because of being forced to do so by physical force. So again, obviously a woman, and I know of a very tragic case like this, that someone I met in Europe, whose husband drugged her, brought her in, and she woke up without a child. Obviously, the same intrinsically evil act occurred, but in that case, the mother, who was completely against her will, in that case, is not subject to the punishment, right? Because she had no culpability. The father and whoever else helped him obviously were. So again, when we say the church imposes this punishment on all acts like this, we're not saying that every person who's involved in the act would incur that punishment, because the church, in true understanding of justice, recognizes there are circumstances. But let's face it, today, as tragic as that one case is, that's the exception. Most abortions of the 1.4 million occurring today are not by people who are being drugged or dragged in or have a gun held to their head. They are voluntarily choosing it. But what does the pro-life movement do? Again, instead of calling attention to this, they do what Matthews did and say, oh no, the people having abortions, they're victims. Well, they're not victims unless they're the case that I talked about, where against their will, someone attacks them basically and does this to them. But we don't want to confront that. Frankly, that's like saying that the ludicrous said to an abolitionist in the 19th century, well, the slave owners are victims. They're victims of their society. They don't know any better, when they're the ones perpetrating or partly perpetrating the wrong. If we move from the issue of how the church's law has dealt with this issue, we see a common trend through the particular human secular laws made throughout the centuries. Now, the first point is that we have to, and again, this is the point used by a lot of modern scholars. There's actually one person who published an article who said women had a right to abortion in the Middle Ages. It's only the 19th century that started outlawing abortion. And they point to countries like England and say they didn't adopt an abortion law in England until mid-19th century. Well, these people know no history. Right? Prior to the Reformation and the destruction of Christendom, the church and civil society shared jurisdiction. So they recognized each other as sovereign powers and said, well, you church will make laws on certain matters, the king will make laws on other matters, and I don't need to make laws because you're making them there. When it came to issues related to the family and marriage, the church had primary jurisdiction. So the laws relating to family and marriage, inheritance, were all dealt with by the church and church courts. And so the civil authorities, the kings, said, well, we don't need to make laws there. We make laws on other matters. Because they had this union of church and state. Distinction between, but working together. And so it's true, if you go into the medieval law books in Italy, Germany, England, there are in the secular law books no laws against abortion because the church was doing it. And everybody understood that. So it would be redundant for that to occur. And again, I already pointed out to you through Gratian and others, the church did have specific laws against both contraception and abortion. Now, what happened, as I said, is the Reformation. And once the church was cut off and said, well, you have no jurisdiction, we don't recognize the church anymore, then civil societies who still were living off the borrowed capital of Catholicism, so they still had somewhat of a moral sense, unlike today. So, abortion's wrong. Oh, we don't have any laws against it because, that's right, we just cut off the church. We need to enact these laws. And so it wasn't that anybody had a right to abortion prior to 18th or 19th century. If they didn't have a right, there became a gap in law when the church was rejected, and then civil society began to fill that vacuum. So what did those laws look like once civil society started to get involved? Well, the Republic of Ireland, for example, and I'm going to take a Catholic and a non-Catholic country as an example. Ireland had civil laws prohibiting abortion in place since at least 1861, when the United Kingdom, of which at that time Ireland was a part, adopted the Offences Against the Persons Act, which made seeking or providing an abortion a felony. So trying to get one or getting one was a felony. Now, the United Kingdom got rid of the Offences Against the Persons Act in the 20th century. Ireland retained it in its laws until 2013, after its repeal by the United Kingdom. Irish law has treated both the one seeking and the one providing the abortion as committing a felony. Now, violators were episodically persecuted. The reported cases indicate mostly that the person who got punished, however, was the provider. Typically, the prosecutors went after the providers, not the mother, but the law still said the mother was doing something wrong. We'll talk about why that might be the case in a minute. The Irish Constitution was amended to protect unborn life because Ireland has been under great pressure from the European Union and the United Nations to get rid of its abortion laws, but the Irish people responded by amending their constitution to enshrine this after the appeal of the Offences Against the Persons Act. So they do still have this in their law. They've adopted amendments to the criminal law to provide for an increasing category of abortions, however, exempt from the law. So Ireland's already started down this path. Once you make exceptions, they're just going to start to grow and grow and grow. So Ireland, who held out longer than almost anyone in their law, that very clear law against seeking or providing, is now down the road of exceptions. There's not been any modern case of a mother prosecuted. However, there was a famous case where the Attorney General tried to obtain an injunction to prevent a girl leaving Ireland to go to England to have an abortion. So under Irish law, he tried to get an order saying you can't leave the country if your purpose is to have an abortion, to stop the abortion from occurring. Again, Ireland, which by that point had started down the slippery slope of sellout to the United Nations, the court did not grant his request. But in terms of the law in the books, he was right on. He had the right to do that. Now, that's our Catholic example, right? But let's look even in Protestant United States, what happened. State criminal law inherited the position of English common law that most abortions were not common law crimes. That's again because English common law developed in the Middle Ages when the church took care of that. So originally, they were left with this gap. However, the states following breaking from England began adopting criminal statutes, which outlawed the act of abortion. Most of these laws, again, were like the Irish. They made the act illegal and anyone who participated, although abortionists were primarily those who were prosecuted in American courts. Cases do not reveal a significant number of women being prosecuted for having participated willingly in an abortion. Throughout the 19th century, states began adopting statutes making the provision of an abortion a crime. So originally it made the abortion itself a crime, the act of the abortion, but then it started making the crime being an abortion service provider. So narrowing in on the providers. These statutes prohibited abortion during all phases of pregnancy. And in fact, most of these states also outlawed contraception, again, until the 1950s when the Supreme Court overruled those. Then we get, obviously, to 1973, when all these laws are overturned by the Supreme Court. What's important about this, to understand it, is, as St. Thomas says, the state doesn't have to punish all crime. And in fact, it shouldn't, because the state is not all-powerful, the state is not God, and the state could do more harm than good if it tries to punish every single crime. So the state has, in political prudence, the ability to say, well, we have limited resources, we're going to enforce this good by these particular punishments, or enforcing it this particular way. St. Thomas says that's okay because the divine law leaves nothing unpunished. So it's within the realm of secular society to say, we're humans, we can't do everything, we want to end abortion. The most effective way to do that is to prosecute the providers, so we're going to shut them down, because it's harder to prosecute the cases against the mothers. There may be more subjective culpability issues that are harder to figure out in that case. Right? The abortion provider is pretty clear. What you're doing, you're guilty for it. As I said, there are cases where the culpability of the mother may be different. So the state may say, look, that's complicated, we're going to fight it this way. Just like in illegal drugs, the state may say, as choices, they say we may punish the people who take the drugs or sell the drugs or both or one or the other. What's the most efficient? What's important about that, what St. Thomas says is, in those choices, the state can always refrain from punishing, but can never say what we're not punishing is good, can never promote it, can never say you have a right to do it. So there's an important distinction between saying we're not going to punish your involvement in this evil act and saying it's okay for you. You're not doing anything wrong. You're a victim, maybe. They're doing something wrong. And again, that's the sense we've lost. So again, I'm not arguing necessarily that Trump shows that we're going to put every woman in jail. That's an issue of political prudence. But what Matthews was saying is women haven't done anything wrong. They shouldn't be treated as having committed a criminal act. And what the church has always taught is they have, if they meet all the requirements for culpability, and the state can never say what they're doing is okay, or that they're merely a passive participant in this act. To understand this, I want to return again to that message of Fatima, to understand why I'm saying this, why this is so important. Again, Our Lady didn't say millions of people would be annihilated. It's not the numbers of individuals that she focuses on. She uses the word nations. Right? And the nation is something more. Again, we're so influenced by Rousseau and Locke and all these crazy philosophers that we don't really understand that concept. We think a nation is a collection of individuals. It's just a lot of people together. The nation is something in and of itself. It is a social being. It has a real being, right? And what is the nation? It is made up of smaller societies that come together to form that society. The most fundamental and basic of which is the family. The family is what starts. It's the seed society that builds the nation. And so if you destroy the seed, you destroy the tree. How do you annihilate nations? You destroy the family. How do you destroy the family? You remove the end of the family. Remember, being and end are united. They're the same. What you are is what your end is. What your end is what you are. So if I change your end, I change what you are, right? The movement of abortion seen in this larger context is an attack on the family itself, because what it says is the end of the marital act is not the procreation of children. And they're raising by a man and a woman, united for life without exception, right? United for life indissolubly. And that is the civil war on the family that abortion is a battle within. The other fronts of that battle, contraception, this same gender nonsense stuff, they're all to destroy the family, which was the error of Russia. The Russian communists, communism wasn't just bad because they put people in concentration camps. That was bad. What really fundamentally is bad about communism is its bad philosophy. Those are effects, and they're horrific, tragic effects, but they're only the effects of the root evil. The root evil is false thinking. And the false thinking is the error that the family doesn't really exist. Right? Remember, what did the communists want to do? Their goal, take children away from parents. What was Hillary Clinton's big motto when she was running when she was first lady? It takes a village to raise a child. Wrong. It takes a family to raise a child. Destroy the family, tear it apart, right? That's the goal of communism. That's its error. And the greatest crime of abortion is that it is a civil war on the family. It is destroying not only a member of the family, but the very end of marriage itself. And that is what leads to the annihilation of nations, because nations cannot exist in the modern philosophical era of individual people in a government. The family is necessary. And that is why we are seeing the annihilation of nations that is just going to continue until when? And again, it's always important to end these conferences on a note of hope, because it's very serious matters. But Our Lady tells us how it will end, right? The triumph of the Immaculate Heart, a period of peace will be given to the world. How will this come about? Through the consecration of Russia. Right? None of us are or will become Pope, so we can't do that, right? What we can do is work towards that by consecrating our families to the Immaculate Heart, to Sacred Heart as well. Ideally do both at the same time. The consecration of the family, the enthronement of the Sacred Heart. When we did it, at the same time we enthroned the Sacred Heart and consecrated our family to the Immaculate Heart. Our society is at war with the family. Abortion is a consequence of that. But we're not going to stop abortion, because we haven't. We've done nothing. Again, I hate to be negative, but since Roe v. Wade, we've not improved anything until we fight the center of the problem, the civil war on the family. When we do that and consecrate our families and live that consecration in our families, we will see the triumph of the Immaculate Heart. Thank you for your attention this morning.